In the fall of 1998, a pregnant college student gets into a car accident. She's okay for the most part, but she hits her head on the windshield hard enough to leave a large bump. She checks in with her father, lets him know that she visited the campus nurse and nothing else seems amiss. Then suddenly, she and her car vanish. People wonder, was she more seriously injured than she realized, driving somewhere in a state of confusion? Or was something more sinister at play? When her car turns up abandoned with hundreds of unexplained miles on it and no sign of the mother-to-be, the clues seem to point to the latter. Now, nearly 3 decades later, what happened to Amber remains one of Wisconsin's biggest mysteries. But something Amber left behind herself may be the biggest clue investigators have to work with yet. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved disappearance of Amber Lynn Wilde. The case I'm bringing to you today was suggested to me by listener Leah, and I really appreciated her sending it to me because I wasn't familiar with it. And once I began digging in, I was troubled by so many of the circumstances. The chain of events that happen with Amber's case are bizarre, but when you sift through everything, a pretty significant motive begins to emerge. But as we know from other cases, a strong motive isn't always a guarantee. I do want to note that I'll be discussing someone who was publicly identified by law enforcement as a suspect during the investigation. To date, that person has never been charged with a crime related to Amber's disappearance and, as with anyone discussed in this podcast, should be presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. And with that, let's get into it. It was Thursday, September 24th, 1998, and Steve Wilde was growing worried about his 19-year-old daughter, Amber. The day before, they had spoken after Amber was involved in a minor car accident, so he was checking in on her. He had also agreed to call her before her 1 p.m. class to wake her up. On Wednesday, September 23rd, Amber had been in what was described as a fender bender when she rear-ended another vehicle near the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Amber attended college here and was a junior, and her family lived about an hour and a half south of campus, where she grew up. Amber and the other driver, a female driver of the second vehicle, exchanged contact information, and the two spoke later that evening to discuss insurance information, and investigators would later determine that it may have been one of the last confirmed conversations anyone had with Amber. Amber told her father that after she had the crash, she went to the campus health center, where she was evaluated and cleared to leave. But despite being described as a minor accident, Amber had hit her head hard enough to crack the windshield and leave a large egg-shaped bump on her forehead. The health office said she may even have a concussion. There was one other important detail. Amber was 4.5 months pregnant. Because of the possible head injury, the health office recommended that someone call and check on her periodically just to ensure she was still doing okay. Just as a side note, we know a lot more about concussions nowadays, and I would be really surprised if in 2026 somebody went to a health clinic at campus and said, "I'm pregnant, I just got into a car accident, and I bashed my head on the windshield hard enough to break it," that they would just say, well, take it easy and have someone check in on you. That person would get sent straight to the ED. But this is 1998, and that didn't happen. So Amber enlisted her father as the check-in person, which was natural because they already talked multiple times a day, typically. And so he called her and spoke with her throughout that afternoon, and she asked that in the next day he call her and wake her up for her classes because she said she had a splitting headache and she just, wanted to be sure she was okay and still made it to everything she had to get to the next day. When Amber's father, Steve, called the next day and Amber didn't answer, he wasn't immediately alarmed, but as the day went on and he still hadn't heard from his normally responsive daughter, he began to worry. Amber then missed her 1 o'clock class, and then she didn't show up for a scheduled eye doctor's appointment that same afternoon. Steve continued to try to call, but there was no answer. Finally, he made the hour-and-a-half drive from Campbellsport to Green Bay and headed to Amber's apartment in the 2000 block of August Street. I'll share a photo of the apartment complex over on the Instagram page at SimplerTimeCrimePod. When Steve arrived, he knocked on the door but got no response. The apartment was locked. He also noticed Amber's car wasn't there. She drove a dark gray 1988 four-door Subaru with Wisconsin license plate X5725T. One detail that made it especially recognizable was the rear window, which was filled with stuffed animals. I don't know about you guys, but I was born in the 80s and grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, and I remember so many of my friends' cars being filled with stuffed animals, and my sister's friends' cars too. It definitely was a thing, but I feel like people don't do it as much anymore. Steve had his own key to Amber's apartment, so he let himself inside to see if there were any clues as to where she may have gone. And nothing immediately stood out. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing unusual, but he did notice that her purse was gone. Unable to reach his daughter, Steve started trying to piece together where she could have gone before assuming the worst. I'm not exactly sure how, but he was able to get copies of her bank and credit card statements, and neither showed any usage. At this point, Amber hadn't been out of touch for all that long, but it was out of character for her. Combined with the head injury and the fact that she was 4.5 months pregnant, Steve decided it was time to report her missing. And he also contacted Amber's mom, Julia, the two who were no longer together, but they still lived in Campbellsport. I will tell you, police took this pretty seriously. I know we always hear 19-year-olds are allowed to go off and do their own thing, and sometimes in that case, the case isn't taken seriously, but they jumped right in with this one. And right away, there were several possibilities to consider. For one, was Amber's head injury more serious than anyone first realized? Like I said earlier, hitting your head hard enough to crack a windshield isn't something to take lightly. Had she become disoriented and driven somewhere without realizing it? At first, that's what both her and investigators thought may have happened, but something still didn't sit right with them because even if Amber had become confused after the crash, her family pointed out that she carried emergency contact information in her purse. If someone had found her, they should have been able to figure out who she was and contact her family. Because Amber's car was also missing, another possibility was that after the first crash, she had been involved in a second accident. Had she somehow gone off the road and simply not been found? If that was the case, every minute mattered. They wanted to find Amber as quickly as possible so she could receive whatever medical care she might need. Some wondered how the teenage college student was managing with her pregnancy. Could she be running away from her circumstances? Amber's mother, Julie, told the paper that it was an unplanned pregnancy and that she was no longer with the father of the baby. She said that both she and Steve did not know very much about the father of the child. She said that Amber had initially been disappointed in herself for getting pregnant in less than ideal circumstances. Having said that, Julie said that the whole family's support was behind her, and that in the last several weeks, Amber had become excited for her pregnancy and was looking at this as the next challenge she was going to crush, going to college and getting her degree and having a baby. And Amber was a high achiever. She graduated from Campbellsport High School in '97, and then she attended a couple of universities before transferring to University of Wisconsin Green Bay and entering as a junior, even though she was still only 19 years old. She beat out around 30 other students to be elected to the UW Green Bay Student Senate, and her long-term goal was to attend medical school and become a doctor. Her family was also offering really tangible support. Amber had an aunt that she was really close to, that lived close, who even offered to help care for the baby so that she could continue her schooling. As the search began, Amber's family printed over 2,000 flyers and distributed them all over from Green Bay to Milwaukee. When nearly a week passed without any sign of Amber or her vehicle, her father made a public plea to her. He said, quote, "I don't care what you've done, what you're afraid of, just let us know where you are." He added that, "We can't help her unless we know where she is. We're hoping she'll come forward and say, 'Here I am.'" I briefly mentioned this before, but wanted to get more into it to mention that Steve Wilde and his daughter Amber were incredibly close. He raised her and her sister as a single father, and he described her as kind of a little grown-up who would say things to him like, "Dad, did you pay the rent?" And she would take care of things around the house. He said it was like living with a little grown-up. He said she was a meticulous tracker and planner, and she had goals for everything. And when he was interviewed about her, you can just tell it takes him right back to raising her as a little girl. His eyes absolutely sparkle when he talks about her. They spoke often, like I said, sometimes more than once a day. So that's why he knew something was up when he couldn't reach her. Around the 1-week mark, Green Bay police continued following up on every lead they had. A detective looked into a couple of reported sightings of Amber and also said he planned to interview the father of the unborn child. According to Amber's dad, Steve, Amber was pretty attached to the baby's father. He described the relationship as a little bit obsessive, but he was also quick to say that despite that, Amber never neglected the rest of her life because of him. She still went to school, still went to work. She handled all her responsibilities. So it's not like she would be skipping these things to go hang out with him or do something because he wanted to. Investigators also learned that when Amber found out she was pregnant, the baby's father was already in a serious relationship with another woman. Naturally, detectives wanted to understand whether any of that had anything to do with Amber's disappearance. But before they could get those answers, on October 1st, investigators made another discovery that would begin to shape where the investigation went to next and an outlook on Amber's safety. On October 1st, 1998, Steve Wilde paid his daughter Amber's rent. With no sign of her, he hoped that even though he was getting an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach at this point, that he would be wrong and that she would just show up and at least she wouldn't have to worry about any issues with her lease for not paying rent. Just hours later, on that same day, Amber's car would be found. It was parked in the lot of the 50-Yard Line Tavern near the intersection of Lombardy Avenue and Ridge Road. Packers fans will probably recognize that area immediately because it's right near Lambeau Field. The tavern and parking lot have since been demolished, but back then in 1998, this was just steps from the stadium. The owner of the tavern told police the car had been sitting there since at least Tuesday the 29th. It caught his attention because it was parked oddly, although exactly what he meant by that has never really been explained because Amber's father would tell the papers that the car was parked right between the lines. Steve Wilde would also say he was doubtful that the car had been there since Tuesday because there had been heavy rain on Wednesday, and he said the pool of antifreeze that was leaking onto the pavement due to a head gasket issue would have been washed away by the Wednesday rain. As far as how the car was found, it was unlocked, the keys were still in the ignition, her purse was in the trunk, and her cell phone was sitting on the seat still plugged in. But there was no sign of Amber. One thing I did think about while researching this case is that a large sports venue like Lambeau Field could be a convenient place to leave a vehicle. There are constantly people coming and going, cars parked everywhere, and someone could easily hope it would blend in. Whether that had anything to do with this case, we don't know. I did look up the Packers' 1998 schedule, though, and that Sunday, September 27th, they were actually on the road playing the Carolina Panthers, so Lambeau wouldn't have had the usual game day crowds that weekend. Just for a reference point, this area is about 12 miles from Amber's apartment. Locating Amber's car with the keys still in the ignition but no sign of Amber certainly wasn't the outcome anyone had been hoping for. Still, her family continued to hold out hope that maybe she was running away from the stressors of her life and that someone was helping her. Steve told reporters, quote, "I just have a gut feeling she's not alone. Somebody else is helping her along in this thing. My daughter is just not this sneaky to keep herself hidden. She doesn't strike me as having the ability to do this for as long as she has by herself," end quote. Because Amber had previously applied for a passport for a planned trip to Italy, investigators were able to obtain her fingerprints and have them entered into the system in case they were found somewhere else. In that same article, Steve said police were meticulously processing Amber's car for clues. One detail he specifically encouraged investigators to pay attention to was the driver's seat. According to Steve, Amber always drove with the seat pushed far forward, almost sitting on the steering wheel because she had really short legs. So if it had been moved back at all, he didn't believe she would be the one who would have driven it. And when they checked, the seat had in fact been pushed back, raising even more questions. The next Green Bay Packers home game was Monday Night Football matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. Amber's parents weren't there as fans, though. Instead, they spent the evening handing out flyers with Amber's photo and description, hoping to reach someone who hadn't seen the story on the news. The flyers described Amber as about 5'3", 135 pounds, 4 months pregnant, with reddish-brown hair, brown eyes, gold hoop earrings, and multiple ear piercings. Steve explained why they thought it was worth spending the evening there, saying, quote, "We're hoping to run into somebody who has seen her and hasn't seen the news of Amber's disappearance. There's a lot of people like me that when the news comes on, I turn something else on. They might not have had the opportunity to see her." Steve also shared that based on his conversations with detectives, he didn't think at this point that investigators were focusing heavily on the father of Amber's unborn child. According to Steve, they had spoken with him a couple of times, but it didn't seem like they believed he was at the center of the investigation. The father of the baby lived in West Bend, about 20 minutes south of Campbellsport, where Amber had grown up. Then, another detail caught Steve's attention. Just 2 days before Amber disappeared, Amber had taken her Subaru in for service, and the mechanic had documented the odometer reading. When the car was recovered, Steve realized there were nearly 900 additional miles on it that nobody could explain. It was another clue, but like so many others in this case, it seemed to create more questions than answers. At the 1-month mark, Amber's father, Steve, began moving things out of her apartment. He felt that even if she was found safe, something was happening in her life that would prevent her from finishing out her semester. He also took a leave of absence from his job as an engineer to focus on the search full-time, and he hired a private investigator. According to reporting in the Herald Times Reporter out of Manitowoc, Wisconsin, Steve reiterated at the time he did not think the father of her unborn child was involved. He said, quote, "I don't think it's the boyfriend. He's not that smart. I think someone's caught on to her and realizes someday there may be a payday, meaning a reward." Investigators, on the other hand, were not so sure. The longer this went on, the more concerned they were about foul play. And when they looked into Amber's life, nobody else had motive to want to harm her. And it was around this point that the man who Amber had shared was the father of her child stopped cooperating and speaking to detectives. As October turned into November and the start of deer hunting season began, Amber's family and loved ones prepared for the worst. They asked the hunters to be on the lookout for any sign of Amber. But as the season kicked off, nobody saw anything. Then, as the holiday season rolled around, the family faced the grief of not having Amber home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, just as the case had really started to grow cold. No new tips or leads or sightings or anything was coming in. February of 1999 passed, the month Amber was due to give birth to her baby, and there was no sign of her delivering a baby at any area hospitals. I can only imagine that to be a very heartbreaking milestone for the family. Still, her family and hometown community continued to pour themselves into the case, holding fundraising events for reward money and to continue to give the case exposure. By March, the family was positioned to offer a $10,000 reward for information, but no new leads came. Willing to try anything, in 2000, Amber's family turned to psychic Sylvia Brown. I've talked about Sylvia on my show before in my opinion on the harm I believe she has done to the families of the missing, but I also can totally understand a family wanting to exhaust every option. Brown told them Amber had been killed the day she disappeared, claimed the father of her unborn child was responsible, and said her body would be found in a river. The family shared that information with investigators who searched several areas with cadaver dogs, including locations near the Fox River. Nothing was found. Police emphasized they would investigate tips from any source, but said they also had to be careful not to divert resources away from more traditional investigative leads. It's a tricky balance, to be sure. One thing I'll mention here, just because there's really no better place to fit it in, is that by 99 and 2000, the relationship between Amber's father's side of the family and Amber's mother, Julie Ketter, it had become very strained. Julie made several public comments saying she felt Steve and his family were taking the lead on the search while shutting her out, and there was some back and forth in the newspaper coverage. I don't say that to suggest anyone was right or wrong. I think it's simply another reminder that cases like this affect families in incredibly complicated ways. Even when everyone wants the same outcome, grief can look different from one person to the next, and that can put relationships and family dynamics under an incredible amount of strain. The 2-year mark came, and the DA made a bold statement. Brown County District Attorney John Zukowski said in a statement that with the right evidence, he'd consider filing charges in a no-body homicide case when it came to Amber. He said, quote, "We've done it before. If we think we have enough evidence to get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, we'll go forward with it. The fact that there isn't a body wouldn't prevent us from going forward." End quote. Each year, there would be annual updates for years. In the early 2000s, there were various searches along Wisconsin Highway 29, which was under a great deal of construction at the time Amber went missing. Police specifically identified areas that would have been filled in with clay and topsoil around the time of her disappearance, and they focused their searches there. When interviewed, they would not specifically say that they came up empty altogether, just that there was no smoking gun. In a 2002 article, the driver of the other vehicle that was involved in the car accident, she gave an interview with the paper. The woman, named Heather, had been a freshman at the time. She said she called Amber that evening and everything seemed fine, but that their discussion to work through damages didn't seem to really resolve anything. So after they got off the phone, she went out to a bar to celebrate her birthday and didn't think much of it. Little did she know she'd be celebrating at the exact same bar Amber's car would later be found at a week later. It's just one of those odd little coincidences in this case. It wouldn't be until 2016 that the public got its first real look at where the investigation had been heading all along. By this point, Amber had been missing for nearly 18 years. Investigators had never stopped working the case, but from the outside, there hadn't been much for the public to go on. That changed in 2016 when a judge ordered redacted versions of previously sealed search warrant affidavits to be made public. And before we get into what they revealed, it's helpful to understand what those documents actually were. During the investigation, detectives had applied for a number of search warrants, and in order to get a judge to approve those searches, they had to submit sworn affidavits explaining the evidence they had gathered, why they believed certain people or places were connected to Amber's disappearance, and why they believed there was probable cause to search them. Because the investigation was still active, those affidavits remained sealed for years. Once they were unsealed, the public was finally able to read, in investigators' own words, how detectives believed the evidence fit together and why one particular person had become the primary focus of their investigation. One of the most significant sections of those affidavits centered around something investigators found inside Amber's apartment shortly after she disappeared: her personal diary. The affidavits also revealed for the first time who investigators believed was the father of Amber's unborn baby. His name was Matthew Schneider. You probably remember me mentioning Amber's aunt earlier in the episode. She was the one who had offered to help care for the baby so Amber could continue going to school. The two were very close, and according to her aunt, Amber confided in her about what was happening with Matt. Amber told her aunt that when she shared the news of the pregnancy, Matt was very unhappy. She said he often put her down, calling her fat, ugly, and other insults. Her aunt was also clear that Amber never told her Matt had physically assaulted her. Instead, she described him as emotionally cruel and demeaning. Amber was surprised by the pregnancy, but according to both her aunt and her diary, she wanted to keep the baby. She also wanted Matt to be involved in the child's life. Her aunt said Amber told her that Matt repeatedly tried to convince her to have an abortion, something Amber had no intention of doing. Matt Schneider was 21 years old at the time. He worked for the highway department. Yes, the highway department that was putting together Wisconsin 29 at the time. He stood a towering 6'5". According to Amber's diary, the two met at a party and began what appeared to be an intense relationship that lasted roughly 4 months. Investigators said that Amber's diary was incredibly detailed. She wrote about everything from their sexual relationship to phone conversations, arguments, and plans to see one another. As the entries went on, detectives said they were able to watch the relationship change as the pregnancy became the focus of nearly every single conversation they had. According to the diary, everything changed after Amber told Matt she was pregnant. From that point on, Amber's entries became less about a new relationship and more about trying to navigate a pregnancy she was determined to keep. Amber wrote that Matt repeatedly pressured her to have an abortion and begged her not to tell anyone about the pregnancy. At the same time, according to the diary, he continued trying to meet up with her. Entry after entry documented phone calls, requests to see one another, and conversations that became increasingly centered around the pregnancy. Amber also wrote that she wanted Matt to tell his fiancée about the affair and the baby, something he was very strongly against. He really wanted to maintain that relationship, and he thought this may ruin it. Eventually, according to the diary, Amber decided to tell his fiancée herself, and she also wrote a letter to Matt's mother. According to Amber's own words in her diary, this only escalated the situation. She documented Matt becoming increasingly angry. In the days leading up to her disappearance, she described his communication as becoming more desperate, controlling, and increasingly filled with ultimatums. Some even crossed the threshold of becoming a threat. When investigators interviewed Matthew Schneider, however, they said his version of events looked nothing like what Amber had documented. According to detectives, Matt claimed he only met Amber briefly at a restaurant. He said they'd only spoken a couple of times, never had a sexual relationship, and that he was not the father of Amber's unborn child. Instead, investigators said he portrayed Amber as someone who had become obsessed with him after a brief encounter. His fiancée also supported that account, describing Amber as having what she called a fatal attraction style obsession. There was just one major problem with that version of events. Investigators had the phone records. Phone records showed Matt and Amber had communicated at least 60 times in the weeks leading up to Amber's disappearance. Yes, 60. Detectives were also able to compare many of those calls with Amber's diary entries, cross-referencing them. They said the diary was so detailed, they could often match specific conversations to specific phone calls, and many of those conversations centered around the pregnancy. One detective later described it as though Amber was speaking to investigators through the pages of her diary. When confronted with those inconsistencies, investigators said Matt declined to take a polygraph and eventually stopped speaking with police altogether. He has consistently denied any involvement in Amber's disappearance and has never been charged with a crime. But investigators didn't stop there. They also began looking closely at another man. To avoid confusing him with Matthew Schneider, I'm going to refer to him simply as MP. MP knew Schneider through work. The two had worked together in 1998 and, according to investigators, remained in contact in the years that followed. According to the unsealed affidavits, detectives interviewed MP numerous times over the years and executed multiple search warrants connected to him. The records don't spell out exactly what investigators believe MP's role was, but they do make it clear detectives believed he had important information about Amber's disappearance. One reason was because of statements MP made very early in the investigation. He told detectives his girlfriend may have seen Amber's silver Subaru around. According to investigators, MP was able to accurately describe Amber's car, even though police had not publicly released a description of it. Detectives wrote that they couldn't explain how either MP or his girlfriend would have known those details. MP also told investigators that Matthew Schneider had told him he went to a movie and dinner by himself after work on September 23rd, the night Amber disappeared. Investigators also found inconsistencies in MP's own statements. When detectives first interviewed MP and his girlfriend in October of 98, they said he came home from work around 6 that evening. His girlfriend told police she spent part of that night trying to reach him because he wasn't home. About a year later, during a John Doe proceeding, both testified that MP was most likely not home that evening. MP himself said he couldn't remember where he had been or what he had been doing. Years later, detectives also questioned MP about just how well he knew Matthew Schneider. In 2014, MP told investigators the two had only known each other for a couple of months through work in '98 and weren't close enough that he would have been willing to, in his words, risk everything for Schneider. But investigators believed the relationship was much closer than that. According to the affidavits, Schneider's fiancée, who later became his wife, testified during a '99 John Doe hearing that Schneider knew MP well enough to ask him to be an usher in their wedding. Detectives also documented that MP later acknowledged they had remained in contact over the years, something investigators believe contradicted his earlier statements. The affidavits also state that Matthew Schneider reportedly told MP he felt guilty about having sex with Amber. Taken together, the diary, the phone records, witness interviews, years of investigative work, and numerous search warrants are why detectives have publicly named Matthew Schneider as their primary suspect. But suspicion, motive, and circumstantial evidence alone are not enough to bring criminal charges. Nearly 3 decades later, Amber's family is still waiting for answers. One thing detectives made very clear in those affidavits is that they believe there are still people who know more than they've shared. Not necessarily the person responsible, but people who may have been told something, witnessed something, or know where Amber is. If that's true, someone has been carrying the answer to what happened to Amber for nearly 30 years. Amber left her apartment expecting to continue with classes, prepare for a baby she wanted, and build the future she had been writing about in her diary. Instead, her family has spent all of those years waiting for answers. Detectives have made it clear they believe someone out there knows what happened. Maybe it's someone who was told something years ago and dismissed it. Maybe it's someone who's been carrying another person's secret. Or maybe it's someone who knows exactly where Amber is. Time changes things. Relationships end. Loyalties shift. Guilt has a way of growing heavier with the years. So if you know something about what happened to Amber, no matter how small it may seem today, now is the time to come forward. One conversation could finally bring Amber home and give her family the answers they've been waiting nearly 3 decades to hear. The FBI continues to work this case alongside local law enforcement agencies, and my belief is that it's only a matter of time until the remaining secrets surface. If you have any information, tips can be shared with the Green Bay Police Department at 920-448-3200. If you wish to remain anonymous, please contact Crime Stoppers at 920-432-7867. You can also contact the FBI via their online submissions form. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work of this podcast, please leave a 5-star review and tell others about the podcast. It's also super helpful if you mention the podcast when people are asking for recommendations on social media or places like Reddit. If you wish to support the show monetarily, I have a Spreaker Supporters Club listed in the bottom of the show notes. Subscribing there gets you ad-free episodes when listened to in the Spreaker app or logged in online. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Be sure to check out my Instagram and TikTok. I'm doing a lot of mini episodes and videos on there to help share other cases and share more information about these ones I cover weekly. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back next Monday.